They were already counting when the wind shifted. 3. The number rolled across the dry street like dust, low and certain, carried by voices that had decided long before this moment how the story would end. Ayanna Redbird stood with the rope resting against her collar, her boots brushing the wooden plank beneath her, not quite lifted, not quite grounded, suspended in that narrow space where a life waits for someone else's decision. The morning sun burned pale over the rooftops, catching in the strands of her dark hair, turning them almost copper where the light struck. No tears, no trembling hands, just a stillness that didn't belong in a place like this. 2. Someone in the crowd shifted, boots grinding against gravel, a hat pulled lower to block the glare. A child's voice echoed the count from somewhere near the back, too young to understand what was being measured, only that the adults seemed certain, and certainty was contagious out here. Sheriff Edgar Boone stood off to the side, one hand resting on the edge of the platform, the other hovering near his belt as if it might remember what to do if given enough time. Sweat gathered along his temple despite the cool morning air, slipping slowly down to his jaw. He didn't look at her. Not once. Because looking meant seeing, and seeing meant questioning, and questioning had no place in a town that had already made up its mind. They said she had done it. That was enough. They said her kind brought trouble, that trouble had found them, and now it needed a name. Ayanna lifted her chin slightly, just enough for the rope to shift against her skin, and when she spoke, her voice carried softer than the wind but steadier than the ground beneath every boot in that square. I didn't kill him. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't even a defense. Just a statement placed gently into a space that had no intention of holding it. The words drifted out, thin as smoke, and vanished just as quickly. No one answered. No one asked what had happened, where she had been, why the story didn't quite fit the shape they were forcing it into. Because truth, out here, wasn't something you searched for. It was something you agreed on. A man near the front, Walter Briggs, with hands too clean for someone who claimed to work the land, folded his arms and gave a short nod, as if confirming the count mattered more than the question. 1. The rope creaked softly, a dry sound, like old wood remembering weight. A breeze pushed through the street, carrying the smell of leather, dust, and something faintly metallic from the blacksmith shop down the road. It lifted the edges of coats and skirts, brushed across faces, and for a brief moment, it felt like the whole town inhaled together. And then, hoofbeats. Slow, measured, not rushing, not panicked, just there. The sound cut through the count like a line drawn across sand, and heads began to turn, one by one, not out of fear, but curiosity. Because out here, anything that didn't follow the rhythm stood out. The rider came into view at the edge of the street, framed by the pale light, his horse moving at an easy pace, hooves pressing steady into the packed earth. He didn't reach for anything, didn't raise his voice, just rode forward until he stopped where the dust settled around him like it knew better than to linger too long. Caleb Thornfield swung down from the saddle without hurry, boots landing soft, as if the ground had been waiting. His gaze moved once across the platform, across the rope, across the sheriff who still wouldn't look up, and then it settled, not on Ayanna, but on the space around her. The plank, the rope, the ground beneath. Something quiet shifted in his expression, almost too small to notice, like a thought deciding whether it wanted to be spoken. Then he stepped forward, just one step, enough for the wood beneath the platform to answer with a faint echo, and said the only word that didn't belong to the moment. Wait. And just like that, the counting stopped. Silence did not fall all at once. It spread slowly, like shade creeping across the street as the sun moved just enough to change everything. And in that silence I turned not toward the woman on the platform, but toward the man who had dared to interrupt what had already been decided. Caleb Thornfield did not raise his voice, did not reach for his weapon. He simply stood there with the kind of stillness that made other men aware of their own movement, his gaze drifting once more across the rope, the knot, the worn edge of the plank beneath her boots, then down to the dust where tracks crossed and recrossed in careless patterns. Sheriff Boone cleared his throat, but the sound came out thinner than he intended, like a man trying to remember authority he had misplaced. "This does not concern you," he said. Though even he did not seem convinced, Caleb did not answer him right away. Instead, he took another step, slow, deliberate. the boards beneath the platform answering with a faint creak, and for the first time Ayanna turned her eyes toward him, not with hope, not with fear, but with a quiet attention, as if measuring something that could not be seen. The wind lifted again, brushing dust along the ground in soft spirals, carrying with it the faint scent of leather and sun-warmed wood. Caleb finally spoke, his voice low, steady, meant for the space itself rather than any one person. Before you finish what you started, you might want to be certain you are finishing the right thing. A murmur moved through the crowd, not loud, not unified, just enough to show that certainty had begun to loosen at the edges. Walter Briggs shifted his weight, his boots pressing deeper into the dirt as though he could anchor the moment back into place. We are certain, he said, sharper now, louder than before. She was there. That is all that matters. Caleb's eyes moved to him then, not quickly, not challengingly, just enough to acknowledge. Being somewhere is not the same as doing something, he replied. And the words landed heavier than they should have, because they were simple, because they were true. And truth has a way of sounding unfamiliar when it is not expected. Someone near the back muttered under their breath. Another shifted their hat lower. Sheriff Boone finally looked up, just for a second, his gaze flickering between the two men, caught in the space between decision and doubt. Ayanna remained still, the rope resting against her neck, her hands bound, her posture unchanged, but her breathing slowed, steadied, as if the moment had stretched just enough to let something else exist inside it. Caleb took another step, now close enough that the dust around his boots settled without being disturbed again. He crouched slightly, his attention drawn to the ground near the base of the platform, fingers brushing lightly across the surface. Not searching wildly, just noticing, always noticing, the kind of movement that belonged to a man who listened to things others ignored. He picked up a small stone, turned it once in his hand, then let it fall, his eyes narrowing just a fraction, not in anger, not in suspicion, but in recognition, like a thought returning after being forgotten. Behind him the crowd shifted again, less certain now, less unified, as if each person had remembered that they were separate after all, that they could think, that they could question, even if only for a moment. You are delaying justice, Briggs said, but there was something thinner in his voice now. Something that had not been there before. Caleb stood again, brushing the dust from his fingers slowly, deliberately, as though time itself had decided to slow with him. No, he said quietly, his eyes lifting back toward the platform, toward the rope, toward the woman who had not begged. I am giving it a chance to arrive. The crowd did not move forward again, but it did not step back either. It lingered in that uneasy middle where certainty begins to crack, but pride keeps it standing. Boots shifted, hands adjusted belts and hat brims, eyes no longer fixed on the woman, but drifting, searching for someone else to decide what came next. Caleb Thornfield did not look at them. Not yet. His attention returned to the ground, as if the answer had been there long before anyone built the platform, long before anyone tied the rope. He stepped off to the side of the plank, slow, deliberate, measuring the distance with his boots, then turned slightly, studying the way the dust had been disturbed, not by many feet moving in chaos, but by something else, something sharper, more direct, like a line drawn and then erased. Sheriff Boone watched him now, really watched him, his brow tightening, because something about the way Caleb moved did not match the story that had been told, and stories mattered out here. They shaped what people believed before they ever saw the truth. What are you looking for? The sheriff asked, his voice quieter now, almost careful. Caleb did not answer right away. He crouched again, brushing aside a thin layer of dust with the back of his fingers, revealing a mark beneath, faint but precise, a heel edge pressed deeper. Then the rest, angled, as if someone had stopped suddenly, not wandered, not stumbled, but stopped with purpose. He traced it once, then lifted his gaze toward the far side of the street where the buildings cast long shadows across the ground. I am looking for the part of the story no one bothered to tell, he said, and the words did not accuse. They invited, which made them harder to ignore. Walter Briggs let out a short breath that might have been a laugh, but it did not carry. It fell flat against the tension that had begun to settle over the square. There is no other part, he insisted, stepping forward now, just enough to place himself closer to the center again, as if proximity could restore control. She was found near the ranch. That is all anyone needs to know. Caleb straightened, turning fully toward him for the first time. Not confrontational, not aggressive, just present, and that presence carried weight. Found near is not the same as coming from, he said, his voice even, measured, like a man laying out tools one by one before beginning work. A murmur passed through the crowd again, softer this time, more uncertain, because the distinction mattered, even if no one had wanted it to before. Ayana's eyes followed the exchange, not pleading, not reacting, simply observing, as if she had seen this kind of moment before. The moment when people begin to realize they might have chosen the wrong path, but have not yet decided whether to turn back. Caleb took a few steps across the open space, his boots pressing into the dust where the sunlight hit hardest, then paused, his gaze fixed on a narrow stretch of ground between two wagon tracks. There, just barely visible, another mark, lighter, almost missed, running in a different direction. He crouched once more, brushing gently, revealing the faint outline of a second set of prints, overlapping, crossing, not matching the story of a single person arriving alone. Sheriff Boone stepped closer now, drawn. Despite himself, his shadow falling across the ground beside Caleb's. "What does it mean?" he asked, and there was no authority left in his voice. Only a question. Caleb did not look up immediately. He studied the marks as if confirming something he had already begun to understand, then said quietly, "It means she was not alone." The words settled into the space between them, heavier than any accusation, because they did not name a culprit. They simply removed certainty, and without certainty, the entire structure of the moment began to shift. Walter Briggs' jaw tightened, his hands curling slightly at his sides, a reaction too quick, too sharp for a man who claimed to already know the truth, and Caleb saw it, not with surprise, but with recognition. Like a final piece falling into place, slowly, inevitably, the kind of realization that does not shout, but cannot be undone once it arrives. The word alone did not accuse anyone, but it changed everything, because if she had not been alone, then the story they had built began to lean, just slightly at first, like a fence post set too shallow in dry ground. Sheriff Boone straightened slowly, his hand falling away from his belt, as though he had forgotten why it had been there in the first place, his eyes moving from the marks in the dust to Ayana on the platform. And for the first time he really saw her, not as a name attached to a rumor, not as a shape standing where judgment had been placed, but as a person standing still while others decided her ending. Walter Briggs stepped forward again, quicker now, the edge in his voice sharpening as if he could cut through doubt before it spread any further. "Tracks do not change what happened," he said, louder than before, forcing the words outward like they needed to hold the crowd together. She was there. She had no reason to be there. That is reason enough. A few heads nodded, but slower this time, less certain, because the ground beneath certainty had shifted. Caleb Thornfield turned his head slightly, not fully toward Briggs, just enough to let his presence be felt. "Reason enough for what?" he asked quietly, and the question hung there, unanswered, because no one wanted to say it out loud anymore. No one wanted to define what they had already agreed to do. The wind moved again, brushing across the platform, lifting the edge of Ayana's sleeve, carrying dust in thin lines across the ground, and Caleb followed those lines with his eyes, watching how they curved, how they broke around the marks left behind, reading them the way other men read words. "Two sets," he said. After a moment, more to the air than to anyone else. One came from the north side of the street, the other from the ranch road. Sheriff Boone frowned, stepping closer, his boots now careful where before they had been careless. "You are certain?" he asked, and this time it sounded like he wanted the answer, not because it would confirm something, but because it might change it. Caleb nodded once, certain enough to stop counting, he replied, and the echo of that earlier count seemed to drift back through the silence, reminding everyone how close they had come to finishing something they no longer understood. Walter Briggs shifted again, his eyes flicking briefly toward the edge of the street, toward the line of buildings where shadows had begun to stretch longer, and it was a small movement, quick, almost nothing, but Caleb saw it, because he had been watching everything that did not fit. "If there were two," Caleb continued, his voice steady, unhurried. "Then someone left," he let that settle, did not rush to fill it, did not push it further, because truth, when given space, has a way of moving on its own. The crowd followed the line of his thought, not all at once, not together, but piece by piece. A man near the back glanced toward the road. A woman lowered her hands from where they had been clasped tightly together. A boy shifted his weight, as if unsure whether to stay or step away. Sheriff Boone exhaled slowly. The sound quiet, but heavy, like a man setting something down after carrying it too far. "Did anyone see another rider?" he asked. And this time the question was not directed at Caleb. It was directed at the town itself, at the people who had been so sure they had seen enough. Silence answered him at first, then a voice, hesitant, uncertain, from somewhere behind the crowd. "I heard hooves before sunrise," an older man said, not stepping forward, not wanting the attention, just offering the piece he had kept to himself. "Thought it was just someone passing through." Another voice followed, softer. "There was dust on the north road earlier. I noticed it when I opened the store." Each word added something small, something incomplete, but together they began to form a shape that did not match the one they had been holding on to. Walter. Briggs' shoulders tightened. His jaw set hard now, as if holding something in place that was trying to come loose. And Caleb saw that too. The way a man reacts when the ground beneath him is no longer steady. He did not point, did not accuse. He simply stood there, letting the truth gather itself in the open air, because out here, justice did not arrive with noise. It arrived when people finally chose to see what had been in front of them all along. The silence did not break. It thickened, settling over the town like heat before a storm. And in that wait, every small sound began to matter. The shift of a boot, the creak of wood beneath the platform, the slow breath of a man realizing he might have spoken too soon. Sheriff Boone turned fully now, no longer standing beside the platform, but stepping into the open space between the crowd and Caleb. As if distance alone could give him clarity. "Who saw her arrive?" he asked, louder this time. Not demanding, but searching, and the question moved through the people like a ripple through still water. Faces turned toward one another, eyes searching for certainty that had been there only moments ago. But no one answered right away, because answering meant responsibility, and responsibility had not been part of the plan. Walter Briggs took another step forward, quicker than before, his voice cutting in before the silence could grow too honest. "This is wasting time," he said, forcing a short laugh that did not carry. "We all know how this ends." But fewer heads nodded now, fewer voices agreed, because something had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough that the ending no longer felt certain. Caleb Thornfield did not look at Briggs. He looked instead at the sheriff. And in that look there was no challenge, no demand, just a quiet expectation, the kind that leaves a man to choose for himself. Boone swallowed once, his throat tight, then spoke again, slower this time. "Did anyone see her with the rancher?" And the question landed differently, because it asked for truth, not assumption. A woman near the edge of the crowd shook her head almost without realizing it. A man beside her glanced down at the ground as if the answer might be written there, and still no one spoke. Ayanna remained on the platform, the rope still resting where it had been, her posture unchanged, but something in her eyes shifted, not hope, not yet, but awareness, as if she could feel the moment stretching, bending, giving space where there had been none. Caleb turned slightly, his gaze moving past the crowd toward the far side of the street, toward the narrow path that led out toward the ranch road, where the dust lay thinner, less disturbed by the gathering of townspeople. And there, just at the edge of sight, something caught the light, small, metallic, half hidden where the ground dipped slightly. He walked toward it without hurry, each step measured, each movement deliberate, as if the act of walking itself was part of the answer. The crowd followed him with their eyes, not because they understood, but because they needed something to anchor themselves to, something that was not their own uncertainty. He crouched once more, brushing aside the dust with care, revealing a small object beneath. A brass button, worn but polished at the edges, the kind sewn onto a ranch coat. But not just any coat. This one marked with a faint engraving, a pattern too fine to belong to common workwear. Caleb held it between his fingers, turning it slightly so the light caught the detail, then stood, his gaze lifting slowly toward Walter Briggs, not accusing, not pointing, just connecting the space between what was found and what was known. Briggs' face tightened for just a moment, a flicker too quick. For most to catch, but not for Caleb. Not for a man who had been watching the edges of things all morning. Sheriff Boone stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the object. "Where did that come from?" he asked, and his voice carried something new now. Something steadier, something closer to authority than before. Caleb did not answer directly. He simply held the button out slightly, letting the sheriff see it clearly, letting the crowd see it too. "From someone who left," he said quietly, and the words settled into the space like a weight finally placed where it belonged. The crowd shifted again, but this time it was not uncertainty alone. It was realization, slow, creeping, unavoidable, because if someone had left, then someone had been there. And if someone had been there, then the story they had built was missing its most important part. Walter Briggs' hands clenched at his sides, his voice rising again, sharper now, edged with something that sounded almost like urgency. "That proves nothing," he said, but the words did not carry the same strength. They fell short, caught in the growing awareness around him. Caleb did not argue, did not press. He simply lowered his hand, the button still resting between his fingers, and looked once more at the sheriff, then at the crowd. And in that quiet, unspoken moment, the truth stood, closer than it ever had before, waiting, not to be forced, but to be seen. The button did not shine anymore once it was seen for what it was. It dulled in the air between Caleb's fingers, not because the metal had changed, but because its meaning had, and meaning has a way of weighing more than iron out here. Sheriff Boone did not take it right away. He looked at it first, really looked, his eyes narrowing as something in his memory began to surface, something small, something he had ignored before because it had not mattered then, but mattered now. "That mark," he said slowly, almost to himself. "I have seen that before." Caleb said nothing. He did not need to, because this was no longer his moment to speak. It belonged to the man who had almost let the wrong ending happen. Boone reached out finally, taking the button with a careful hand, turning it once, twice, as if the truth might reveal itself if he gave it enough time. The crowd leaned in without stepping forward. Drawn by the quiet gravity of the object, Walter Briggs shifted again, but this time. It was not forward, not confident. It was a half-step back, small, instinctive, the kind of movement a man makes before he realizes he has made it. And Caleb saw that too. The way a man begins to retreat before anyone has told him to. "Where did you find this?" Boone asked, his voice steadier now, but lower, as if he did not want to disturb what was forming. "Near the edge of the platform," Caleb answered. "Not where she stood, where someone else did." The words settled cleanly, without force, and that made them harder to deny. Boone lifted his gaze slowly, his eyes moving across the crowd, searching not for agreement, but for recognition. "Who here wears buttons like this?" he asked, and this time the question carried weight, because it was specific, because it could be answered. A man near the back shook his head. Another lifted his coat slightly as if to show his own. Different, worn plain. A woman glanced toward the general store owner, then away again, and still no one spoke, because the answer had already begun to form in the spaces between them. Walter Briggs cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the quiet. "Plenty of ranchers use brass buttons," he said quickly, too quickly. "That proves nothing." But his voice no longer filled the space the way it had before. It slipped, just slightly, enough for doubt to catch it. Boone turned toward him then, not abruptly, not accusing, just with a slow, deliberate motion that mirrored Caleb's earlier stillness. "You were at the ranch yesterday," Boone said, not as a question, but as a memory returning. Briggs' jaw tightened. "I pass by often," he replied, but there was something thinner in the words now, something stretched. Boone nodded once, as if placing another piece where it belonged, then held the button up slightly, letting the light catch the engraving again. "And you wear a coat with markings like this," he added, and this time it was a statement, simple, grounded, impossible to ignore. The crowd shifted again, but now it was not uncertainty alone. It was attention, focused, narrowing, turning toward a different center. Ayanna stood unchanged on the platform, but the space around her felt different now, less like a place of ending, more like a place waiting for something to be undone. Caleb stepped back slightly, just enough to remove himself from the center of the moment, because it no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the truth as it unfolded. And to the people who had to decide whether they would follow it or turn away, Boone took a breath, deeper than before, as if drawing in something he had been avoiding. Then spoke again, his voice carrying farther. Now, not louder, but firmer. Before we go any further, he said, we are going to understand exactly who stood here and why. And in that moment, the rope above Ayanna did not move, but its purpose began to loosen, not by force, not by command, but by the simple act of seeing what had been hidden in plain sight all along. The word understand lingered in the air long after Sheriff Boone spoke it, and for a moment no one moved, not because they were told to stay still, but because they no longer knew where to go. The shape of the moment had changed, and when shape changes, direction follows. Boone stepped closer to the platform now, not as a man enforcing something, but as a man correcting it, his eyes lifting toward Ayanna for a brief second before dropping again, not out of shame alone, but out of recognition, as if he had finally seen what had been in front of him all along. Walter Briggs shifted again, but this time the movement did not go unnoticed. It drew eyes, quiet at first, then more, the kind of attention that does not ask permission. It simply arrives. Caleb Thornfield stood off to the side now, arms resting easy, his presence no longer pressing, just steady, like a post set deep enough that it does not need to prove it can hold. Boone turned slightly, the brass button still resting in his palm, and said, Walter, not loudly, not harshly, just clearly, and the name carried farther than any shout had earlier. Briggs looked up, his expression tightening before smoothing again, but the delay had already spoken for him. You said you passed by the ranch, Boone continued, his voice even, each word placed carefully. What time was that? Briggs hesitated, just for a breath, but in a place like this, a single breath was enough. Late afternoon, he said, and the answer came too fast. After the pause, like something chosen instead of remembered, Boone nodded once, not agreeing, just noting. Strange, he replied. Because the tracks say someone came through after sunset. The crowd shifted again, but this time it leaned toward the words, not away from them. Because tracks did not lie the way people could, Caleb's gaze moved briefly across the ground again, confirming what had already been seen, not adding, not interrupting, just holding the line steady. Briggs let out a short breath, something between a scoff and a laugh, but it did not settle. It drifted, thin and uncertain. Tracks can be wrong, he said. Wind moves dust. And for a moment that sounded reasonable, until the silence answered it. Until no one stepped forward to agree, Boone lifted the button slightly, turning it once more, letting the engraved edge catch the light again. Wind does not place this, he said quietly, and the simplicity of it cut deeper than any raised voice could have. Ayanna's eyes moved between them, not with urgency, not with fear, but with a quiet awareness that the moment was no longer rushing toward an end. It was unfolding, piece by piece, and each piece mattered. Boone took another step, closing the distance just enough that Briggs could not pretend. It was still the same conversation as before. You were closer than you said, Boone added, and this time it was not a question. It was a conclusion. Briggs' jaw tightened again, his hands flexing slightly at his sides, a small movement, but one that no longer went unnoticed. The crowd had shifted too far now. It was watching him the way it had watched her, and that change carried its own weight. Caleb remained still, his eyes steady, not accusing, not pressing, just present, because sometimes presence is enough to let truth reveal itself. Briggs glanced around, as if searching for something to hold on to, some familiar certainty, but the faces he met were no longer aligned with him. They were uncertain, questioning, no longer part of a single voice. And that was when the first real crack appeared, not in the story, but in him, small, almost invisible. But there, I told you what I saw, he said. But the words no longer filled the space. They faded before they reached the edges. Boone did not respond right away. He let the silence sit, let it press. Because silence, when used well, can do what force cannot. It can reveal what a man is trying to hide. And in that silence, the town began to see something it had missed, not just in the dust, not just in the button, but in the way one man stood and the way another did not. It was not the words that broke him. It was the silence that followed them, the kind of silence that no longer protected, no longer agreed, but simply waited. And in that waiting, Walter Briggs found himself standing alone in a space that had once carried him. Sheriff Boone did not step closer this time. He held his ground, the brass button resting heavy in his palm as if it had always belonged there. "You said late afternoon," Boone repeated, not accusing, just placing the memory back where it did not fit. "But the tracks say after sunset, and this was dropped here, near the platform, not near the ranch." Each detail set down like a stone, simple, undeniable. The crowd did not murmur now. It listened, fully, because the story they had been holding no longer held them. Briggs opened his mouth as if to answer, then closed it again, his gaze shifting, not outward, this time, but downward, toward the dust he had ignored before, as if hoping it might offer him something it had already given to another man. Caleb Thornfield did not move, but his presence remained, steady, unshaken, the kind of stillness that makes movement around it visible. Ayanna stood where she had always stood, but the space around her had changed completely, no longer a place of ending, but a place where truth had paused everything else. Boone took a slow breath, then spoke again. Softer now, but clearer than before. "You were here," he said, and this time it was not a question. Briggs shook his head quickly, too quickly. "I told you, I passed by," he insisted, but the words no longer reached anyone. They fell short, caught in the growing weight of what had already been seen. Boone lifted the button slightly again, letting it catch the light, then lowered it just as slowly. "Buttons fall when a man moves fast," he said, "or when he turns too quickly to leave," and the image settled into the minds around him. Not forced, not dramatic, just there, complete. A few people shifted, their attention no longer uncertain, but focused, the kind of focus that does not look away. Briggs' shoulders tightened, his breath coming just a little sharper now, not loud, but enough to be noticed, because everything was noticed now. Everything mattered. Caleb's eyes moved once across the crowd, then back to Briggs. Not pressing, not demanding, just allowing the moment to continue. Because truth, once it begins, does not need to be pushed, it unfolds. Boone took one final step forward, closing the space not with force, but with certainty. "If you were here," he said, "then you saw what happened." He let that rest, then added, "Or you were part of it." The words did not strike, they settled. And in that settling something shifted inside Briggs, something that could no longer hold the shape it had before. He looked up then, not at Boone, not at Caleb, but at the crowd, and what he saw there was not agreement, not support, but distance, a line that had been drawn without anyone saying it. And that was when the truth stopped being something outside him and became something he could no longer carry. His voice came again, but quieter now, thinner. "You do not understand," he said. And it was not a defense, not really. It was something closer to a confession waiting to form. Boone did not interrupt. Caleb did not move. The crowd did not speak. They simply waited. And in that waiting the final piece began to surface, not pulled, not forced, but rising on its own. Because out here, the truth does not arrive with noise. It arrives when a man can no longer pretend it is not already known. The words did not come out all at once. They arrived slowly, uneven, like something that had been held too long and no longer knew how to leave. Walter Briggs kept his eyes on the ground at first, as if the dust might still hide him, but it did not. Not anymore. He was not supposed to be there, he said quietly, and the sentence did not sound like an excuse. It sounded like the beginning of something he could no longer keep inside. The crowd did not react. It listened, because now there was nothing left to assume, only something to hear. Sheriff Boone remained still, not interrupting, not pushing, just holding the space open. Caleb Thornfield stood where he had stepped back, silent, allowing the moment to belong to the truth alone. Briggs swallowed, his voice rougher now. "I went to speak with him about the land," he continued, each word heavier than the last. "He refused, said he would not sell, not to me, not to anyone." A faint breeze moved through the street again, but no one shifted this time. No one looked away, because the shape of the story was finally becoming clear. "I left," Briggs said, then paused, his shoulders tightening as if the next part resisted being spoken. "But I came back." The words settled deeper, not loud, not dramatic, just final. Boone's eyes did not leave him. But something in his expression changed, not anger, not even judgment, just the quiet recognition that the truth had arrived on its own. And she, Briggs added, his voice faltering slightly. She was already there. Near the trees, she saw me. He stopped again, and the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full of everything that had been missing before. Ayana's gaze remained steady, not accusing, not reacting, just present, as if she had been waiting not for rescue, but for this moment, the one where truth spoke without being forced. Briggs finally looked up, his eyes moving across the faces in front of him, searching, not for support now, but for something closer to understanding. But what he found instead was distance, a quiet line that had formed between who he had been and what he had done. "I told them she did it," he said, and the words came easier now, because once truth begins, it does not stop halfway. It was easier, they already believed it. A few people lowered their eyes, not because they had been named, but because they had been part of something they had not questioned. Boone let out a slow breath, then stepped forward, not quickly, not forcefully, just enough to close the space that had been held open. "That is enough," he said quietly, and the words carried the weight of a decision finally made with understanding, not assumption. He turned then, his attention shifting to the platform, to the rope that had remained untouched through all of this. And for a moment he hesitated, not because he did not know what to do, but because he understood what it meant. Then he reached up, steady, careful, and loosened the rope where it rested, not with urgency, not with drama, just with the quiet certainty that it no longer belonged there. Ayana stepped down when the tension left the line, her boots finding the ground fully this time, and for a brief moment she stood still, not moving away, not speaking, just standing where the ending had almost been. The crowd did not speak either, because there were no words that could return what had nearly been taken. Caleb watched from where he stood, his expression unchanged, not satisfied, not proud, just calm, as if this was never about winning, only about seeing. Ayana turned her head slightly then, her eyes meeting his for the first time without distance. And in that look there was no gratitude spoken, no debt formed, only a quiet acknowledgement, the kind that does not need language. Caleb gave the smallest nod, almost nothing, then turned away, his boots pressing into the dust as he walked back toward his horse, not waiting, not staying. Because out here, justice did not ask for attention, it did not linger. It arrived, and then it left, and as the wind moved once more through the emptying street, carrying away the last traces of what had almost happened, the town stood in a silence that felt different now, not heavy, not uncertain, but aware, because they had seen it, all of it, and once something is seen, it cannot be unseen.